sharing. Okay, so everybody should see communication as the slide that's up. Is that right? Okay. Yes, no, can I see a little thumb or something? Awesome. Okay, thanks guys. Okay, so last week we focused on negotiation, and I really wanted to emphasize negotiation because you don't have to be a perfect communicator to negotiate. And that's why that went first, because I don't want you to be burdened by the specifics, the semantics, the details of communication that we're going to discuss today when you're thinking about your own needs. That's a little different than what I'm going to say today. So make sure that you mitigate the context in which I'm teaching you things, because when you are communicating, it's very situation dependent, right? You would communicate differently with your friends than you do in class, than you do in an oral exam, right? For example, for the most part, well, I'm pretty much the same in general. Maybe I curse a little more in my private life, but in general, this is how I communicate. I try to have as little difference because I try to be as open as possible. Exactly, Monica. Or when you're communicating, I don't know if you saw Monica's message. I thought there was somebody that needed to be let in. Oh, that was funny. Like when you're communicating with also the target of your communication. That's such a perfect example. So if any of you have kids, your communication with your children is something you never want anybody to see, for example. So at least some days I'm like, oh my gosh. So yeah, so that it can change and vary, but that's why I wanted to keep negotiation and conflict very separate. So you realize that you don't need to you're like, oh, I'm not good enough to negotiate. My communication skill, no, you're already good enough to negotiate. So you don't get to assess your negotiation skills because your assessment is biased. There, I said it. It's true. Why? Because you also have a wall of your own self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and self-efficacy at something that you've never done before. When it's something you've never done before, you immediately think you're not good at it. So that's why negotiation had its own little time, and I decided to put communication over here. So now we're going to go into a few of the intricacies of communication. I love this section because a lot of students are like, why the heck are we doing this? We're going to be managers. I'm like, that's why you're doing this, because 99% of your job, yes, I gave you all the functions, is actually figuring out how to transmit all those functions that you really want to, all those tasks, everything that you want to accomplish. You need to transmit those. You need to get people to do them. You need to be able to do them yourself. So this is really at the crux of it all. And one of the things you'll notice if you have a chance, when you have a chance to have your internships with your CEOs or in the C-suite or the director or whatever you do, you're going to notice that there is a substantial amount of some of the most incredible communication. Watch how people in leadership positions communicate. People don't typically get into leadership positions just because they have a stellar resume. They get in there because they know how to communicate. So take that into account, because nobody is ever done with communication. I'm still not done with it. I myself consider myself not the greatest communicator because I'm constantly trying to reevaluate and reflect on what I do. And I constantly stumble, but I'm trying to remember that I need to, I have areas that I can improve. So one of my favorite quotes, I don't actually know if this is him because now I'm like, wait, is this the right person? Whoever said it, I love this quote because this is the crux of communication is whatever we think we said and whatever was actually perceived, that is what we perceive to be communication. And often it's an illusion. And so the biggest problem in communication is the illusion that communication has actually taken place. Because it is a frightening path and ups and downs of biases, perception, how you're feeling that day, how the other person may have worded it, the tone, if they said it so dramatically and loudly that you're already taken aback, or if they said it so quietly that you're like, oh, do I take this seriously? I don't know, she's kind of saying it quietly. It's probably not important. So these are all things that affect how we perceive communication. So in a nutshell, now communication, I don't even pretend to tell you that there's a whole field dedicated to communication, communication studies, communication etiology, communication barriers, communication disorders, things like that. This is not that course. This is one, this is only in the context of management and in the healthcare organization. There is so much more. So we're going to try to just cover a few pieces and have a bit of fun with it. Okay. So in general, what we're defining communication as is sending or receiving information between two entities, right? So it's usually people, two organizations, two departments. Does that make sense? So that's what we're going to define. Those are the barriers of our definition of communication. And you can see that the goals of communication are, in general, due to inform, to persuade you, to educate you. So this is our communication, is to educate you, to compel you to act, which is similar to persuade, but really it's a call to action, if you've heard of that, and to reinforce or empower. And so some of you come to see me because you're feeling uncertain about something. I can provide you the same information you probably already have, but in such a way that it empowers you or reinforces what you want, what you're thinking or what you want to know. If anybody can add anything else to this, I'd love it, because just jump on in. This will be a pretty organic discussion. And so I'd love to hear everybody's input. So we're dividing communication into two sections. So it's going to be verbal and nonverbal. And you'd be surprised at what an important element that nonverbal communication plays in our lives. So even though, for example, we've had to completely change the schema or our perception of nonverbal communication and verbal communication with online communication, it still matters. So, for example, what do you have your camera on? Do you have your camera off? Well, on face value, you're like, wait, why is the camera off? What have I done? That's nonverbal, right? But we also contextualize it. So as we get into cross-cultural communication, we'll talk a little bit about that. But I do want you guys to observe yourselves and consider, are you right now, especially with the camera off, are you non-verbally, are you in a position that you normally would be when attending class? And I hope you don't feel like I'm, asking something, but you could say like a check mark if you are just sitting there, or if you are like laying on the sofa, or standing up at your computer because you have to cook as well for family, or you're at work and you're not able to actually turn the camera on. So are you in a normal position that you normally would for class? Or are you, so those are the things you think about when you think about the camera being off, because you no longer have that accountability. You don't actually have to answer, but just think about it. And if you do feel like answering, jump in. I don't mind at all. Okay, so anybody want to jump in on that? No, I feel like I'm making people confess, and that's not my intention. So I'm going to move on, but if you want to jump in, please do, or in the chat, please be more than welcome to. So we're going to start with nonverbal, and nonverbal communication is exactly what you think it is, okay? But there's much more to it. So for example, one, interestingly, is proxemics. Has anybody heard of proxemics? In the car? Oh my God, please don't be looking at any video. Be careful. But has anybody heard of proxemics? You may also know this as personal space. So how many of you, okay, and this makes it really hard with the pandemic. So this lesson is a little challenging with the pandemic. But how many of you are very, very, are people that need a lot of personal space? I mean, before the pandemic. So there we go. So you like a lot of personal space, okay? Now, so yeah, we'll think in the before times when we actually interacted with other humans, if you need a lot of personal space. And how many of you think are like, personal space? What's that? So how many of you are okay with no personal space, or whatever personal space might be? You're very flexible. Okay, so a lot fewer. Okay, so I'm actually one of those lot fewer, like I don't have any personal space, any concept of personal space, because part of it is cultural and part of it is just that I like to talk. And so I assume everybody else likes to talk, and that's something that I have to work on constantly. But that's one way that we have to consider. In the organization, you need to think about the proximity of the manager to the subordinate, or the proximity of the patient to the nurse. So, or the patient to the whoever else is communicating, right? So taking into consideration their context is really important, especially when you have, if you have a vulnerable person, so patient, or a power differential. So does everybody understand what I mean when I say power differential? And this is it. Power differential. Oh, I need to look at this chat because I know you guys always talk on the chat. It depends. Okay. Yeah, it depends. That is true, because if I'm in a bed, I'm like, oh, I use my hands to talk. Yes, yes. Some of us do. But the power differential is when we're thinking about the manager-subordinate relationship, is with respect to the hierarchies, especially in the US, depending on the type of organization, the traditional hierarchies or across professions. So when there's a power differential, you want to take that into account. And for example, if your boss is sitting behind a desk, they should, so if you're the manager, you should come out from behind your desk and either sit across from the person that you're speaking to, especially if it's a more difficult conversation, than sitting behind your desk, or sitting higher than one of your employees, or standing while they're in a seated position. Does that make sense? So these are really things that are already a good way to set the stage when you're working with your colleagues, because believe it or not, that body language makes a big difference. Okay, and then we also have,
really quick. With the power differential, the example that you just gave me meant that we should, as managers, avoid power differential, or like you said, we should come behind the desk and try to talk to our subordinate, or
it is like a gap. Like if you're the CEO and you're talking to like a frontline manager, that's a big power differential, a big power gap.
okay.
So the CEO is the one that has to make the effort, right?
Okay, I understand that.
But if you're the manager, I mean, just minimize that gap, if you will.
Yes.
Close the space, not physically necessarily, but close the space power-wise, okay? So another one is kinesis. So we have proxemics and kinesics. And kinesics is just your body language, right? So it's, you know, if we can think about, we hear these cliches, right? If looks could kill, you could see somebody's face. Not everyone is going to share the same facial expressions or eye behavior that that you do. So for example, my son, I don't have to talk to him. He knows when I'm happy or when I'm not by looking at my face. Most of my friends can tell as well, because I have a very, I don't have a good filter with my face. But when I'm thinking, I look very concerned. I had a grad student once that was telling me about something great that she did, and I was very excited about. I was listening, so my active listening face is not a happy one, apparently. And she said, "What's wrong with your face?" And I was like, "What? What?" She said, "You look very concerned." I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry, that's my listening face." So I, as a professor, have to think about like the facial expressions I make, or I have to tell my students, "Hey guys, this is my focusing face," because otherwise it kind of freaks people out. So think about that. It doesn't mean you have to adapt to every single thing, but it does mean to keep in mind that a person's facial expression may not necessarily mean what you perceive it to mean in that moment. And lastly, there is what's called paralanguage, and this has to do with the voice. So as you guys, I've told you several times, I have a very low, loud voice. So it can be a little bit intimidating at times, and I can't help myself. It's just how God made me. So I'm just like this. But I make sure to indicate that I'm aware of how loud. All right, y'all can talk about that in the chat. But I have to think about that. But I also have to think about, I don't want to be monotone. I don't want to be, because that's also going to kind of lull everybody to sleep. And I also don't want to sound like, when I'm giving feedback, like I'm always mad, for example. When I could give feedback like, hey, you did a terrible job. No, you don't do that either. But so you have to really contextualize that nonverbal communication, and it really makes a difference. Does anybody have any examples of any nonverbal communication snafus that got them in trouble? I already told you about my face, so I don't think it can get worse than that. It's scaring my students. Anybody want to share? No takers, fine. Verbal it is.
I just wanted to share something, like you said, Dr. S, and you also mentioned one time that you feel better because I also have a loud voice. I think it's just cultural. With Southeast Asians, we're just loud and we need to be heard. But I mean, as far as nonverbal communication, I'm trying to work on this myself. Like, I walked into my daughter's school office, and she was always, released early. And then a couple months later, my daughter told me that the lady at the front desk told me that your mom just intimidates me. I was like, oh my God, I had no idea that I was even doing that. All I did, I walked in, and was like, okay, is my daughter there? That's maybe I had a commanding voice, or like you just said. So I'm trying to work on this. How to not do that, I still don't know. So just wanted to share.
That's a big thing, because for a while, and that's why I tell you guys that I have a loud voice, because I felt really bad when students would think that I was being angry or because it made me feel like a bad teacher. And so I had to indicate that. And I'm pretty sure I've scared my son's teachers before too, by the way, because I'm very direct in how I speak. So that's a great example, especially a lot when you begin to manage your team, is to say to them, this is how I speak, or you don't owe an explanation for how you speak. Nobody owes an explanation for who they are. I want that to be very clear with you guys. Nobody owes an explanation, but we do owe each other some understanding of how we all communicate differently. Because I have students that are very shy, and I love to hear from them, but I have to be very careful because I don't want to scare them away. And so that's another, not scare them away, but make them feel like they're not welcome because they're not super outspoken, because some of the best leaders are introverts, just so you know. Some of the best President Obama, for example, introvert, believe it or not. So just to give you an idea that everybody's communication style is important to the conversation. So that's a really great point. Thank you for sharing, Talat. So we're going to move into verbal communication now, which will get us in a lot more trouble. But the thing about verbal communication is that, especially in today's era, we're not just communicating with words. We have now gone sort of back in time, and we communicate in symbols as well, which you may know as emojis. And so that is something that can convey some critical information, and not necessarily in the best fashion. So that's something to think about. So you have to consider what's the context. In what emotional state are you trying to convey this information, right? So is this good news? Is it bad news, right? That's very simplistic. And then how much of the news are you going to, how complex is this? Are you telling me the entire plot to Game of Thrones, or are you telling me we're to have brunch next Tuesday? And then how urgent is it? Is it happening today? Do we need to get caught up on Game of Thrones tonight because the new episode's coming out tonight? Yeah, I know it's dated. Okay, I know it's over. Or is it something that's going to happen next week? And then I haven't talked about the channels, but we will in just a second. Because then you think about, are we texting this? Are we calling? Are we emailing? Are we faxing? And then who is this that you're talking to? Are you talking to your boss? Or are you talking to your friend? Or are you talking to your son? So when you think about this, communication is really hard. And how many of you wish that they would think before they talk more? Because I sure do. Because I'm like, I never take any of this into account, by the way. But you're getting this information so that in the future, especially when, for example, your information can be subpoenaed, you can think about what you're sharing and is it the right thing, right? So when we think about levels, we want to think about the transmission intensity, right? Is it chit chat? Is it deep conversation? Or is it, interactional? Like, are we exchanging information? Or is it transactional, meaning I need something back? So information you're usually getting it. This is interactional. But transactional requires contact. It requires all three before. Interactional and transmissional, and it also requires context. So transactional is what is one of the hardest levels. I don't care that you remember the levels. I want you to think about, you can almost assign your friendships this way. Think friends that you have that you just chit chat with, talk about the weather, colleagues. Then you think about interactional relationships, if you will. So these are colleagues that are good for information, you exchange information, right? And then transactional are mentors or people that understand not only the context of your life, but also the goals that you have professionally, but you also just check in with each other. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So, oops, my little thing is not working. Oh, dear. Did that work? Yeah. So to give you an idea, this is an adaptive slide. I just realized I didn't put the attribution, but it's from Daft and Langle, and it's really about the richness of information. And so I put at the left, if you look at the steps, I made it into a step visual. So the lowest form of information richness, which if you can remember is not just like good news, bad news, the content, and richness does include complexity and things like that. The lowest form in terms of making that connection with you for communication is something written or a newsletter or something that's very generic, if you will. So something very sterile. And the highest form, if you look, is face-to-face meeting. So this is the richness because I can tell you're nonverbal and verbal. So a good way to remember what information richness is how much human contact is there. So with a moderate to high, if you look at phone calls, I kept fax in there because they had it, but honestly, who faxes anymore? But email, which is, if you read the paper that I put up, email and communicating context and sarcasm, a phone call, text, you lose that, right? You lose a little bit of that. So you could be really offended by something you read or text, when in fact, that person just put it in all caps because they were in a hurry. And you don't know that, right? So this is a way to take into consideration how much information, how important is my message that I want to convey. For example, how would you convey a cookout for your department next week? For the whole department, not just your division.
You could send an email out informing everyone.
Yes, you could. Definitely. But it's the whole department, so maybe you don't know everybody in the whole department. You just know the people in your division. In this case, the department is bigger than the division. Division is smaller. For those of you that are, because organizations name stuff differently. But yes, and we all get listserv emails, right? But is that oops, oh, what kind of email would that be?
Junk mail.
Okay. So maybe something a little bit more, because you want people to go, Rosie, you organize the whole thing.
Right. I mean, I don't know, set up flyers in the department area kind of thing.
Okay, so you're gonna be sitting over here at moderate, right? Okay. So yeah, so if it's email, you have to think about if it's individualized email, because this is referring to emails to an individual, by the way. And I probably should have put individual email, not chain, or not, how do you call those? Group emails. Where would you guys put group emails? Why don't you guys help me decide where to put group emails or listserv emails or whatever you want to call it? If you had to decide in information richness, where would group emails go?
Lowest.
Okay. Anybody agree, disagree? So not an individual email, a group email. Oh, I see. Agree, lowest, moderate. All right. So I would actually put it in lowest or moderate, but that's where it would go. I did just notice something that somebody said, I would not categorize video conference Zoom as highest. I love that. Can you elaborate on that?
So would this be an example of a video conference or Zoom, our class? Well, do you think that's compatible to face-to-face meeting in a classroom? Is that the same category? I think you.
Do you
that goes
think
back
it's
to the beginning
comparable?
of our class. I mean, how many of us are here with the video on? Actually, how big is this class? 28.
Okay. So remember, it's about being able to detect nuance, and it is about being able. So this is not a black and white directive. This is a suggested directive. And Monica, you're absolutely right. Information riches can vary, but information riches can also vary in face-to-face meetings, right? So if a person is not attuned to the conversation, that can also impede information sharing and connection. But I think the idea is, and I just put Zoom, but any video conference type, the idea is that individuals are present visually and via audio. So I would say there's degrees of highest, there's degrees of moderate high. Yes, I think you're right. It just depends, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not valuable, because, for example, when we compare video conference to text or email or phone call, I would say maybe phone call and video conference are very close because of that differential with the video. Let's say video quality. Let's say a person has to have the video off because they're working or for whatever reason. Then I would say those are probably, maybe if I had better graphic design skills, I would probably move phone call and video conference more to the border between moderate, high, and high. But for now, we're just going to let them sit on each of those. However, I do believe that email and text do not convey nuance, as well as phone call or video conference, because what's something you can get, even if you can't see, we just talked about it, what's something you can get that you can't get in an email or text? What's something you can get from a phone call or a video conference with no video, just audio?
Tone.
Yes, tone. So if you need to be in on a call and you have the opportunity to call or video with no video versus email or text, you still want to pick a phone call or a video, especially if you need to get things done, or especially if there's a delicate topic, because you need that tone to understand and help you understand the context in which a situation is occurring. Okay. And consider that when we talk about crisis communication.
Dr. I feel like you're hitting on a lot of points. And one of my qualms, I guess, with this graphic or like the categorization is that I feel like this is all more on a spectrum, and it should look more like almost like a timeline, and there's different notches on the timeline, because I feel like when you're grouping things together, it's sort of boxing them in to the same category where the nuances are pretty extreme, maybe between a phone call versus an email or something like that. So I don't know.
Think of it more like having confidence intervals. Because yes, there's definitely overlap, but keep in mind also that this is the whole point here is kind of if you see the linear element of it. But I welcome any graphic support. This is what PowerPoint has.
I'm trying to be really critical either. I just feel like, what is it? When I'm conceptualizing all of these things, I just sort of see them more. It feels more like a spectrum to me.
And that is actually the point, is what I was trying to demonstrate is that it's a linear, there's no end all be all there, because for example, a web page or an individualized letter could also have very personal elements similar, like they could personalize the individualized letter, but it's still not a personal email. So yeah, you're not wrong. And that's the whole point, is that this is definitely, it's not like everybody's in one bucket. It's not an end all be all. I'll have to come up with a better graphic though, thank you. So that it does, maybe I'll say it's a spectrum, information richness spectrum or something. And see if I can make it a little bit more user friendly. Okay, but everybody understands all of this, like I said with communication, it all depends on the context, the receiver, the sender, the information content. So even with this, there's still so many other things to consider. So what does communication look like? And so this is, I don't by any means want you to remember this, but I do want you to think about it whenever you feel like you have sent a message out and then you're thinking, why haven't they written me back? Why haven't they responded? So start with the top left corner, it says sender. So you have a thought and you want to send a message and you say, hey, how's it going? There went the message. Oh, we're texting suddenly. So I just texted. The receiver is getting the message. My assumption, because now think about the barriers, right? Or potential context, is they immediately got the message because I immediately sent the message. And so they must immediately get the message. So there begins the first barrier, time. Then begins the second barrier, which is the receiver receives the message and they have to decode what I said. How's it going? What do you mean, how's it going? What do you know? Did you hear about something? Is something wrong? What happened? What's happening? Why are they asking me how it's going? Who are they? Who's sending the message? Does the message matter? What's the weight of the message? Who is this person that's asking me how's it going? Is it somebody I'm very close to, or is it somebody that I don't know so well? So do you see how this can begin? Now everybody's going to be like, I never want to communicate again. Please don't do that. But essentially, the receiver has to not only receive your message, but sorry, I'm trying to stay looking at the camera, but the slides are over to my right, so that's fine. But they also have to consider the uncertainty and the context that you just sent the message in, right? So the person that sent it felt fine sending the how's it going, and the person receiving it then has to think, okay, oh, it's from my mom. Okay, well, I don't really want to tell her everything that's happening, how, my dog died, I broke my foot, and my house caught on fire. So I'm going to create a message and I'm going to just say, fine. Right? So off this goes to, so now we're at do you see where we are in the quadrant? So the receiver received the message, then they create it here. This is fine. Oh wait, can you see my little annotator? Let's see. My little pointer. Okay, so here's the receiver. Here's the message back, and it says, fine. I'm fine. That's it. Now the message goes back to mom. what do you think the decoding is going to be for mom?
Something is wrong.
That's a mom. It could be
Or
like,
she's
okay,
not-
you're fine, good. Off
yeah,
with
or,
it.
or maybe she's trying to just avoid me and just make it short and not tell me everything. She just said it's fine because we're so nonchalant.
Maybe. It's also a product of the previous communications, right? But typically, when you are doing this messaging, you should always remember that the feedback should contain some element of the DNA of the sending message. So let's try this again. So the sender says, how's it going? And the receiver reads the message, and their message back is, can we do it next Tuesday? So do you see how their communication did not occur, even though both parties think they communicated, right? So the way that you would fix that feedback message is you would say, I'm fine. I need to move our meeting. Can we do it next Tuesday? Something like that. Does that kind of make sense? But you should never respond to a message without having acknowledged the message received. I'm sorry, respond to the same sender without acknowledging a message received. Does that make sense? I know it seems very complex with my graph here, but believe it or not, this is something that is actually quite helpful because of this piece, the barriers and environmental and personal barriers. So often, if you know the person well, you're like, oh, yeah, you mean our meeting? Sure, no problem. But if you don't know the sender well, then you're like, what are you talking about? What's happening? And that's where we begin to have breakdowns in communication, okay? So there we go. So you can read a little bit about this, but we talked about this. Imagine communicating with only emojis. You see how it would become a little bit more difficult? And so that's something that you really want to think about. Let's see here. Did I cover everything? Channels? Yes. So one of the ways to make sure that you're thinking about being understood, because that's what you want as a sender, as an initiator of communication, is think about how your message may be decoded. So it's not just about how you encode your message and send it, because you could say, well, I was very clear, but the person receiving your message, maybe they're not at all in your field. Maybe they have no idea where you've been or what you're thinking about. So context is helpful. And this is where I'm always talking about definitions. Because when you can define things, so in this case, they would say our meeting, how about next Tuesday or whatever I said. So does that kind of make sense? Okay. Let's make sure we talked about everything. So when we're thinking about feedback, even responses are a form of feedback, right? And we can make responses related to the content of someone's communication, but we can also make responses or feedback or encode messages to how a person is communicating, right? So not just what they say, but how they say it. It's better to focus on what a person says unless the person specifically asks for feedback on how they say it, because that's not going to be as well received. Unless it's something like, for example, your professional eval, that's a good place to ask that. Say, how is my communication style? So not only is the information, the content valuable or useful, or is it clear, but is it also delivered in such a way that it's helpful, right? And we're going to get into the other fun part of that. Okay, so let's apply that to the healthcare org. Who do you communicate with? Who will you communicate with? You're going to communicate with professionals, so doctors, nurses, administrators, staff, a lot of people. You're going to communicate with individuals. You're going to communicate with the community. You're going to communicate with stakeholders. And then depending on the level, eventually you may communicate, make larger messages for the public or society at large, and or with federal or regulatory agencies when you're doing things like reporting. Some of the issues related to that are the environmental and contextual barriers that we described, right? So when we're thinking about that encoding, more than anything, it's not necessarily, sadly, that our messages will get blocked, which sometimes we wish they were. Usually what will happen is that our messages get distorted or filtered in such a way that is not what we intended. That is not to say that it's your fault. It's to tell you that, the vast majority of miscommunications are not technically due to any one person being this, person that's just angry and trying to, rah. It's really about the decoding and encoding and a mismatch between that. And so it's so important to be open to that, so that if somebody responds in a way that is feels aggressive or feels, you have to remind yourself, wait a second, did I encode my message in such a way, or was I clear enough? Or is that person just having a really crappy day? And a lot of times, sadly, we're human like that. So, and I say that, but I also ask me anytime I get a review or comment on my publications, I'm fairly certain that they're evil. So, that's why you have to take a step back. You can always delay that email. But so these are barriers that can make a huge difference in our careers in some cases, because we'll shoot off that tweet or we'll shoot off that email, and then we're like, oh my goodness, I wish I hadn't sent that, right? So some of the contextual barriers to think about are your time. Most of the time, we'll probably regret an email that we responded to very quickly because we didn't have time or we didn't think about what we might have said. And by the way, I'm guilty of all of these, so no judgment. Also hierarchy. So when we think about, I think this is more of a top-down issue. I don't believe it to be, most subordinates are very respectful to their managers, but I have seen a lot of lack of stability by higher-ups to more subordinate employees. So for me, if you ask me about the hierarchy issues, it's top-down. Other issues can lead to organizational complexity is all the jargon, all of the forms, all of the formality, all of the red tape in the organization can lead people, sorry, I'm glancing over at the comments as I watch it, can also lead people to question someone's competence when in fact it's just a lot of acronyms and you don't know a person's seniority. So be very careful when you're communicating in 50 acronyms when you don't know if your full audience is actually familiar with those acronyms, right? Because acronyms are a great part of org culture building, they make you feel part of the organization, but they're also really, really, there's a lot of them. And you can't assume that everybody is as excited about them as you are, again. Personally, bias is the biggest factor. So if you recall, all of you did your bias quizzes, and it's not a question of that if you're biased, it's a condition. If you're biased, if you have bias, because we all have bias of some kind. We have bias of sedans over trucks or Ford over every other car. That's my bias, as in not Ford. But so that's kind of, so we all have different biases. We can inherently accept that, or we can continue to say, no, I don't. It's up to you. But it makes it much easier when you recognize that there could be the potential for bias. And that makes a huge difference in how you communicate. There we go. So this, oh, whoops, did I go? Oh no. So when we think about bias, culture is a huge one. And it's not just about culture in terms of how, individuals from different cultures, but it's also from even our own geographically, our social norms, our sense-making schema. So whatever made sense to us growing up, that's going to give us a certain level of bias. And then, the physical context. So information symmetry, who knows more of what, right? And how important is that? So it's the weight of that information. And then we have perception. So perception cuts across all of these, in particular with relation to culture, because the concept of homophily is the sameness. And so we organize in thinking that we're more familiar with people that look like us. Well, when we are in a diverse organization, which actually improves the performance of the organization, we can also be subject to bias. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the biases, because I think it's really helpful to think about these things. Because one of the most common biases that we don't think about is called fundamental attribution. Has anybody heard of fundamental attribution? Nobody? Well, get ready, you're about to. But basically, fundamental attribution is to blame internal versus external factors for others' behavior. So, for example, and I'm going to read an example to you, let's see here. So this is a story. He said, for example, when I worked at an urban college in Denver, Colorado, I often had students come to class irritated, saying, I got a parking ticket. I can't believe those people. Maybe some of you will relate at SDSU because it's so fun. Now, granted, I know some of you haven't been on campus because we just started, so just pretend you're parking somewhere else. Why don't you get a real job and stop ruining my life? And often you can see like a lot of these TikTok videos where people are getting really upset about getting caught parking illegally. And in this case, illegally parked individuals attribute the cause of their situation to the malevolence of the parking officer, essentially saying they got a ticket because the officer was a bad person. That is an internal attribution. Anybody know anything about that? Thoughts, comments? Any other examples they want to share? So, for example, I'm sure if I asked my son to share an example of how he was grounded for something, it would be attributed to me being mean and not him not finishing his homework. That's another example.
And I feel like sometimes, even like in grad school, when we're all mature, like when you get sometimes like a bad grade on a paper, you're like, the teacher just hates me. Like they don't get what I'm saying. I think people are like a little bit past that now, but sometimes you can kind of, bring that bias
you
in.
would not be wrong. No, you're actually right on. It's human nature. It's human nature because the other bias is self-serving. So we actually attribute fundamental attribution to ourselves. So Gabby, you nailed it. That's a perfect segue to self-serving bias. So self-serving bias, I love that you said that, because it all the time it's like, well, this was not explained well, this was that, and or the teacher didn't teach this, or the teacher didn't mention this in class, or I've heard so many, or we all have, that it makes me laugh because I'm like, I don't know how to answer that. But it's true to a certain extent, mind you, because some professors just don't explain things well either. So, but the self-serving bias is when you do get a bad grade, you blame the teacher. So that's the individual. So fundamental attribution is to others' behavior. So your own behavior is self-serving bias. So that's what a great example for Gabby. And on the flip side, if you do stellar, if you get an A, who do you blame? Anybody? So if you get a bad grade, you blame the teacher. But if you get a good grade, do you blame the teacher? You're like, God, that teacher's so good. Look how good she trained me. Dang, she's amazing. No, what do we do? Anybody? Come on.
Credit yourself.
Go ahead, Jordan.
Oh, you credit yourself. You're like, I'm so amazing. I'm so great. Look at that well I did.
So my advice to both is share the blame, good or bad, in fundamental or self-serving. So that if you did poorly, yeah, blame the teacher to some extent, but also blame yourself a bit. And if you do great, blame yourself a lot, but also blame the teacher a bit. Does that make sense? I know I'm using blame in a positive and negative valence, so don't get confused. But also, it will help you as a leader to do that with others' behavior, that fundamental attribution. So, for example, if you see that traffic cop putting out tickets, yeah, go ahead and say they're a bad person, but they're also kind of doing their job. So don't forget that. Or if you see, I can't think of anything now, but you know, my son, if he's mad because I grounded him, yeah, maybe I am mean, but he also didn't do his chores. So if anything, just split the difference versus completely putting it on one person, okay? That's how you address that bias, or at least begin to develop that example. So a couple of other cool biases, and I don't mean cool, but the other thing I want you to remember also is we do this with people that are different from us. So we're even worse about it if a person is different. Let's say they go to another school. Let's say they work in a different department. Let's say they're another race, ethnicity. We subconsciously do this. So that's another way to fight against these types of biases, is to remember, wait a second, I'm giving myself too much credit, or I'm not giving them enough credit. So take that into consideration as you consider this. So another one has to do with primacy, or which you guys have heard of is first impression, and recency, which is we attribute a person's character on the most recent element. So maybe you knew somebody 10 years, but their most recent behavior is what you are attributing their whole behavior. And same with first impression. A great first impression, and you attribute their whole behavior. Those are also biases. They're myths. They're not real, or they shouldn't be. So with halo and horn, has anybody heard of the halo and horn effect? No? Okay. So halo and horn effects are pretty much what they sound like. So the halo effect is if somebody makes an initial positive primacy bias, right? If there's an initial positive first impression, then no matter what they do after that, it's going to be good. Because you're like, oh, but they were so good at the beginning, right? Halo. Does everybody know what a halo is? The little, like angels wear the little ring, which implies goodness, perfection, whatnot. And the horn effect is if they make an initial negative first impression, then everything after that, it is so much harder for them to overcome. Can anybody see how this can create a huge issue with bias in the workplace? Any thoughts on that? Comments?
I was wondering because I often actually hear the halo effect framed in the way of like people who we deem as like the ideal look or image is better at their job. And I think this goes into a lot of systemic issues, but I didn't really think of it as just other attributes, but.
Oh, you would not believe. So if you did the bias quizzes, the halo effect and the horn effect, conversely, are not just image. So pretty people, height is subject to the halo effect. Weight is subject to the halo effect. Race, ethnicity is subject to the halo effect. So if we perceive somebody by any of these attributes, or we bunch them together, so if there's intersectionality, they're already actually not intersectionality, then we have these, if somebody is tall, non-person of color, and perceived as attractive by societal standards, then there is already an initial halo effect. And I don't know if any of you have experienced this or have observed this, but this is actually something that there is definite research evidence for. And same with the horn effect. If somebody looks what's considered unprofessional, so maybe they have a nose piercing, they have a tattoo, they are short. This happens more for males, by the way, gentlemen. I'm not saying it's right. I'm telling you the research on it. Then there's a perception or a bias of less capacity. Now we're getting better about this as a society, but we're still terrible. And so if you are a person of color, that's already counted towards the horn effect, because there's going to be concerns. And those concerns are that horn effect, that bias. And that bias can easily turn into racism. So that's where you have to really think about, when we think about halo and horn, that's why I grade blind. That's why I try to grade, I tell you guys only to put your ID, because I don't want to be affected by your gender. I don't want to be affected by your years of experience. I barely know what all of you look like, so that helps. That's one good thing about online classes. So I don't even know how tall everybody is, but I know that I try not to be biased, but I am just as susceptible as everybody else because I'm human. So these are things you really want to think about. So thank you, that was a great point. So how do we overcome these barriers? Well, listening, really trying to listen. And sometimes you kind of have to stop and really try to listen, because sometimes we're trying to multitask. When it comes to cross-cultural communication and just people, try to listen instead of trying to do multiple things at once. And the closer you are to that highest richness, the better off you're going to be as a listener. And so that comes along too with reducing hierarchy, right? So narrow that power differential. And then think about the words that you say, because even the words we say do matter. So if we are joking around, if we do, be careful with that, because sometimes what you think is a joke, especially in a work environment, may not be funny to somebody. And so that's something that you have to think about, because everybody comes from a different background. That doesn't mean you don't enjoy yourself at work, and it doesn't mean you only select people that agree with your sense of humor, but you just remain cognizant that everybody has a different frame, and that's the beauty of it, though, is that everybody can bring a different perspective. And context. Who are you communicating to? What's the message? How important is it? So think about that. If you're not going to put I don't know, somebody's illness notice on a company newsletter, you're probably going to send out individual messages to everybody and let them know somebody's ill or something like that. And try your best to address attribution and self-serving bias. So give yourself less credit, give others more. Just a little practice, okay? So now the other thing about communication within the org is that it happens in different places, right? The communication can be top down, it can be bottom up, right? So these are from superiors to subordinates, from subordinates to superiors. So the communication will be different, won't it? And then, so from the top down, it could be something like a company memo. From the bottom up, it could be a letter from employees or a report to them. And horizontal is your peers. Does that make sense? Because when you think about the encoding, that's who you're going to think about. So you can read about this, because I don't think we need to go into all of it. And diagonal is usually like with a matrix organization. So now we think about communication patterns, right? So this is the chain. This first one is how most managers think that information travels, right? So this is sorry. There we go. So this is from like nurse to nurse supervisor to nurse manager to, oh, I'm not using my little pointer, sorry. You guys crack me up. Where's my little, okay. So you see here, nurse supervisor. What did I say, nurse supervisor? Hold there. You got it. Supervisor, blah, blah, blah. The traditional hierarchy that we have, right? Then this one is two subordinates reporting up to a supervisor, if you will, or a director who reports up to the VP, who reports up to the CEO. So it goes the other way. Does that make sense? The wheel is what? Everybody reporting to one person. You see how to read this? So in the circle, it's just the two people, right? So the communication is only occurring between two people. And the all channel is pretty much everybody communicating with everybody. So in looking at that, just to give you a little more description, so if you want to know what the chain does, and the Y pattern, so the chain is a staff nurse, I told you that. Y pattern is 2 people. Now in terms of the wheel, that pattern is rare because there's that notion of a gatekeeper. So do you guys see this one? So the wheel pattern is typical of, like, let's say the center is like the CEO and the vice presidents are the ones reporting to the CEO. That's where so there's no communication between each vice president. There's not common communication between each vice president. And then let me see. The circle pattern. So the nice thing about the all channel and the wheel right here and the all channel is that this is very efficient communication. These are the 2 most efficient forms. Can anybody guess why these are the 2 most efficient forms? And efficiency is described as transmitting information to everybody in the little circles as fast as possible.
I understand like why all channel would be very efficient because everybody is communicating with everybody and we're all on the same page. So there's no confusion, no room for confusion. So
Right.
I don't know about the wheel though.
So it's a similar point with the wheel because it assumes that the center is the main point of contact. And once you've communicated whatever you need to communicate, this is the only channel that needs to be filled, if you will. So that's what makes it efficient. They have a direct line to the top of the channel. But the channel is just 2 people, right? Technically, for each spoke. I didn't say it was rich. I just said it was efficient. Does that kind of make sense?
So the wheel communication pattern would be efficient only when there's one boss or the top manager or supervisor, and then the subordinates are the ones that are around him, correct? It's only going to be considered efficient in that kind of setup.
Yes, but there's not a situation at the lower levels like a manager where the subordinates would not talk to each other, right? So this wheel pattern is saying that each individual outside of the center does not talk to this person, to any of the other 3, right? This person only talks to this person. So you think, in what scenario would this ever be true? And so the example I gave you is the vice presidents. Like, let's say across a divisional organizational chart. So vice president of the company at this location, vice president at this location, in this location, in this. So they don't really have a reason to talk to each other. They would just report directly to the CEO, for example. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. No.
Or in instances of secrecy, when you need that gatekeeper, because usually you don't want to have a gatekeeper of information unless, and we'll get into gossip in just a second. But does that kind of make sense? So it's efficient, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best for good communication, okay? And so the circle pattern does allow you to communicate with at least 2 others, and there's no central authority, but you only get to communicate with the people to your left and to your right, if you will. Obviously people aren't typically in a circle, but that gives you an idea. And then circle and all channel, though, are the ones that typically improve morale because everyone tends to be equal or more equal, because even though the circle is only 2 people, there's no central authority. So there is a sense of equality there. So these are the kind of different ways that you can imagine communication. And when you think about which network, as a leader, you need to think about how you want to disseminate information, right? So you probably don't want to do something like the wheel, because that is implying that you are the only source of information and you want everybody to go through you for information. That's probably not going to help build collegiality and cohesion with your team, right? So that's probably not a good centralization. But that might be a good risk management strategy for example, if you're doing like a crisis plan, right? So things to think about are the degree of centralization. So which members have more communication versus less. So that's where we talk about efficient communication, things like high risk, right? When we think about leadership, the why and the wheel are the most centrally located person that also has the hierarchy. In terms of satisfaction of the group, the all channel is high and the wheel is the lowest because it leaves many people out, right? So the whole group may not be satisfied because they don't get to talk to anybody else in the wheel. But individuals in the wheel may be happy because they have a direct line to the president. So do you see how they have that individual one-on-one communication, but they may not have that group cohesion that can be seen in the circle and the all channel. So even how your communication is structured is also really important. The other type of network when we think about communication is the informal network. And this is what we call the kind of the grapevine, right? So this again, if you look, this looks just like the initial one from the org communication. This is how managers think that informal information flows, right? So we think that, I'll call it gossip. We think that information that's informal or not from the organization, leadership, or sanctioned goes from one person to another to like a game of telephone, and then it ends up at person Y over here, and it's totally wrong, right? That, oh, I cannot click on this thing. So there's definitely, this is not right because that's not how gossip works. So at the end of the day, in fact, informal networks really operate like clusters. So cluster, oh, I'm going to click again. It's going to make me keep clicking on it. Clusters are the combination of gossip and probability. So if you see gossip, you see one tells all, but it's really not a question of one tells all. It's one tells multiple, maybe not all. And then the probability of that, the multiples continuing that chain. Does that make sense? So here you can see cluster once tells some. So it's not all because that never happens. Not every single person is privy to gossip, if you will. But there's multiple people that do receive informal communications. And then these people pass it, you know, maybe, so is everybody looking at cluster? So A tells C, D, and F. But C and D are like, oh, I gotta go home, I'm busy, I can't tell you. But F is like, oh, I'm working late. Let me tell Jim and Tina over in whatever, this other department. And that is how informal information flows. It doesn't flow in any other, I mean, and this is a structured pattern in and of itself, mind you, right? So this is actually following, this is studied actually with the infection model, susceptible, infected, recovered. So it's called meme diffusion. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but it's infection. So when you think about a meme going viral, when you do this too, you are also in a cluster. How many of you have Facebook? Okay, one, okay. Okay, how many of you have, God, I feel so old right now. No pressure.
Instagram.
Instagram. So when you share something, it's just Facebook is the easiest, but when you share something or you tag somebody, do you tag every single person in your friends list? No. Or, I mean, well, maybe you do. Then I need to talk to you because you're an outlier and I need to write a paper about you. But most of us do not tag every single person, right? So we already are not gossip one tells all, right? So, and then we can see, and we may not necessarily see every time, but how many of all the people you tag would you say share what you shared? So let's say you tag 10 people. Let's say you got a super cool meme from Dr. Shafino's end of module. And you're like, I got to share this thing. It's the bomb. Yeah, I said it's the bomb. And you're like, I got to share it with 20 of my friends. So you get on there and you're like tagging 20 people. It's a lot of people to tag, by the way, so do that. I'm impressed already. How many of those people, 10 people, let's say 10, 5 if you want. How many of those though would you say are gonna share your sick meme? Would you say, how many would you say 100%? Nobody. Okay, then you're all normal. I was just kidding. But that is how memes diffuse, or also known as how informal communication occurs. God, I'm choking, sorry. Okay. All right, I'm going way too slow, so I gotta hurry up. So a message will contain what you want. Always make your ask. Contextualize it within the organizational importance of that message. So why does it matter? Especially for a strategic message. So this is a message that you want to matter. This isn't like, where are we going for dinner tonight? This is in the organization, by the way. And then think about who you're going to tell. Who are you telling to? And what kind of feedback are you desiring? So when you encode your message, encode it with a feedback in mind. Those are the key elements of a good strategic message, is make sure you make it contextualized, make sure you make an ask, and make sure that you know who this applies to, right? And when we're thinking about communicating with stakeholders, that's the hardest group to communicate because that's the most diverse group. So just to give you an idea, we're not there yet, hold on. This is the potential stakeholders of an health organization or health program. Just these, so a hospital, for example. Think of that when you're thinking about stakeholder mapping. If you want ideas, start there. What you can do is when you're at an organization is you can think about what kind of relationship, right? So when you're identifying your potential message receiver, how can you determine the stakeholders and the valence? So the valence is positive, negative. Like, do I have a good relationship with them or is it a little contentious? And you can do this, by the way, with a Delphi approach, which you learned. So if you look closely, the large US hospital has a generally neutral relationship with non-hospital corporate services. They have a generally positive relationship with the local board, right? But they have a generally, I wouldn't say negative, with competing hospitals and third-party payers. More third-party payers, right? Because they're constantly arguing about reimbursement. You really should go for a neutral with competing hospitals, not negative. But you know, this hospital has clearly got some beef. But that also helps you with formulating messages. So for example, if you're in a community that you've already made a lot of mistakes or you've done things that you realize that you have to do some community building, then you need to take that into account with your messaging. So we're not going to talk about crisis communication, but I'm going to tell you that there are definitely special situations in which communication is absolutely critical. And we'll stop there because I want everybody to take a break, but first download this paper. And it's going to apply to your, let's see here. It's going to apply to your email that I sent you. So before I split you guys up into groups, please download this paper and fill it out as best you can. Do not talk, well, you can talk to each other, but do not share your responses or anything like that, okay?
Dr. S,
Yes.
I can't seem to find the email that you sent. I've tried like typing in every possible like entry for the title, but I can't find it.
I think, Ruth, I sent it to your Gmail because I don't think I have your.
Oh, I think you sent it to my other email. Okay, now that makes sense because I remember getting it, but I couldn't find it in my school email. Okay, thank you for the reminder.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, because I couldn't find your SDSU email for some reason. Okay, this is now, it's saying there's a network error.
Oh, that's weird.
Word doc.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, no, I'm sending everybody a Word doc in the chat and it's not wanting to load. Is anybody getting a Word doc from me?
No.
All right, give me 1 second. Let's see if I can get it to load this way. Why is it wanting to load? It's just a Word doc. Anything? Oh, that might have worked. It's called Lost on the Moon Comcase.
It's there.
Yep, I got it.
Okay, everybody download your own, please. And kindly take a break and fill it out.
Where is it, Dr. Shafiano?
It's in the chat. It's a Word document in the chat, and I'll open it and share it with everybody. So what you're
I
gonna,
don't see it in the chat.
oh really?
Me either.
How do I, why did it do that? Okay, I'll try it again. How's that? I uploaded it again. How about now?
Nothing here. Yeah, I'm gonna
You guys
stay
able to receive?
I was able to download it, Dr. Shifano. I was able to do it.
Too. I got it both times.
Same.
So I wonder if those of you that are on Zoom that aren't getting it, are you not allowing downloads? Because that might be a part of the case. And I'll post it, but essentially what you're gonna do is, the key is, oh, that's not the one I want. The key is that you're gonna answer it from the perspective of the email you got. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So I need everybody to proclaim that it makes sense. Does everybody understand?
Yes.
Okay, so you got it. And Ruth, are you good?
Yeah, I ended up finding it in my personal email.
You found it?
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, and I'll post this, but because I just saw the time, so I'm always talking about. That's okay. We'll open up with, but at least now you have context. So rank your choices, but through the lens of your email. Okay. Does anybody have questions about that? If you have specific questions, personal message me. Do not say them out loud because I don't want you to give up the goose. This is a lot harder online, by the way. This is like a big experiment. This works a lot better in person when I can just hand you things. So we're gonna do our best. But does everybody kind of get that? Taylor, you don't have the link. Okay, hold on. And everybody should have the same, oh, hang on, somebody else just came on. This is what you're all gonna fill out. Everybody got the same document. Let me share. So this is what you're all working on, right? Oh, just kidding. I shared the wrong thing, didn't I? Oh no, this is it. Can everybody see this? It says Lost on the Moon.
Yes.
Okay. So all you're doing is you're just ranking. Do not do this part yet. We're gonna open up next week with this because I'm once again out of time. But that all your work is to do this. But within the context of your of the person you were given, of the role you were given. Okay. And I gave that to you in the email.
So, Dr. S, everybody has a different role.
Maybe.
Are we doing this as a group? I'm a little confused. Are we doing this as a
No,
group?
don't, just do the ranking via the email that you're doing. That's all you need to know.
Okay.
I'm gonna stop the recording though.